Let me ask you something. You ever loved someone so much that it scared you? I am talking about the kind of love that bypasses logic, tears down your walls, and shines a light into the darkest corners of your soul. Because here's the truth, most people don't understand about avoidance. They're not cold. They're not heartless. They're protecting something sacred, something fragile inside that maybe, just maybe, never felt safe enough to be seen. But love doesn't let us hide forever. It calls us out. It challenges every story we've built around why we can't trust, why we have to run, why we should protect ourselves before anyone else can hurt us again. And here's the breakthrough. Avoidants only do this when they truly love. They stay, they face the fire, they open the door they swore they'd keep locked forever. Why? Because love, the kind that transforms us, doesn't ask for perfection. It demands presence. It says, I see your fear, but I love you anyway. And for the avoidant, that's not just uncomfortable, it's divine intervention. See, the moment someone who's built a lifetime of emotional armor chooses vulnerability, it's a miracle in motion, not because they became someone new, but because they remembered who they really were beneath the fear. That's what love does. It doesn't erase our pain, it redeems it. It says, you don't have to run anymore. You're safe here. You're seen here. When avoidants truly love, they don't just show up once and vanish. They become students of connection. They learn how to stay. They learn how to speak. They learn how to hold and be held. And that, my friend, is not weakness. That is the highest form of courage. Because choosing love when your entire nervous system is telling you to run, that is spiritual warfare. That is freedom. That is legacy. So if you're the avoidant, let this be your awakening. You're not broken, you're becoming. And if you love an avoidant, understand this. They may not say the words. They may not cry the tears. But if they're leaning in, fighting their instincts to run. That is love in its rawest, rarest form. The kind of love that doesn't just change relationships. It changes generations. It creates safety in places that used to be war zones. It teaches the soul that it is okay to be human, to be messy, to be real. So, wherever you are on this journey, don't settle for the shallow. Don't bow to fear. And don't walk away when you were born to stay. Because when love is real, even the most guarded heart learns to open. And in that moment, heaven touches earth. Avoidants often carry a deep-rooted fear of vulnerability that shapes the way they relate to others. This fear isn't born from indifference or a lack of desire for closeness. On the contrary, it's often the result of early emotional injuries, abandonment, neglect, or inconsistent caregiving that taught them one core belief: closeness is dangerous. To them, intimacy feels like exposure, and exposure feels like risk. So, over time, they learn to protect themselves through emotional distance, self-reliance, and control. They master the art of keeping people at arm's length, not because they don't care, but because caring has historically been costly. But something shifts when they encounter real love. True love doesn't knock politely, crashes through the walls they spent years building. It's not always loud or dramatic, but it's persistent. It's safe, consistent, and warm in a way that feels foreign. It catches them off guard. It unsettles their nervous system because it contradicts the old programming that says, if you get too close, you'll lose yourself, or worse, you'll be left behind. That's when the real internal conflict begins. On one hand, their instinct is to pull away, to retreat to safety, to sabotage before they get hurt. On the other hand, there's this growing desire to stay, to trust, to try. This is where the power of love begins to break the avoidant cycle. Love doesn't necessarily erase fear, but it begins to speak louder than it. It creates a new data point in their emotional experience. Where once there was betrayal, now there is consistency. Where once there was abandonment, now there's presence. Where once there was judgment, now there's compassion. Slowly, the avoidant begins to test the waters. They start letting themselves be seen bit by bit in the smallest of ways: a deep conversation, a touch longer than usual, a moment of eye contact that lingers. They're not rushing in, they're recalibrating their nervous system to something. It's never known: safety and closeness. And that's why vulnerability from an avoidant is so sacred. It's not a casual decision. It's a tectonic shift. It means their heart is overriding their survival instinct. They are choosing to lean in when every cell in their body is telling them to lean out. That's the power of true love. It bypasses logic. and touches the soul. It triggers a transformation that is spiritual in nature. When an avoidant starts to feel true love, they begin to notice that vulnerability, once their greatest threat, is actually the pathway to fulfillment. They realize that intimacy doesn't have to mean losing themselves. It can mean discovering themselves more deeply through connection, through being held, through being known. But it takes time, and it takes trust, not just in the other person, but in the unfolding of a new emotional reality. This is not about becoming someone else. It's about returning to who they were before fear took over. Beneath all the armor, there is a longing for closeness, for connection, for communion. And love, when it's real, meets that longing with patience. BTLE on the outside, but it's seismic on the inside. Because for an avoidant to move toward vulnerability is to defy years of conditioning, and that's something only real love can inspire. Avoidants are wired for self-protection. Their nervous systems have learned that emotional closeness often precedes pain, rejection, or the loss of control. So they default to comfort zones built on independence, emotional detachment, and routines they can manage. Comfort, for an avoidant, isn't just a preference, it's survival. It's the mental and emotional space where they don't have to risk being hurt, misunderstood, or consumed by the needs of another person. Their identity becomes tightly linked to self-sufficiency. The idea of needing someone or allowing someone to need them feels like a threat to their autonomy. But when an avoidant falls into real love, something radical starts to happen. That protective layer of comfort, once their shield against chaos, begins to feel more like a prison. Love awakens a desire in them that is stronger than their fear. It's not instant and it's not smooth. It begins subtly. Maybe they start thinking about the other person more than they expect. Maybe they feel a pull to reach out, to share a little more, to linger a little longer. These small shifts are often dismissed by others, but they are monumental for the avoidant. Because at their core, avoidants want connection they've just spent a lifetime pretending they don't, because it never felt safe enough to want it. True love challenges that narrative. It introduces a new internal equation: stay comfortable and safe, or step forward into the unknown and risk something real. This choice is not a one-time event. It happens in layers, in moments, in tiny decisions. Every time the avoidant chooses connection over their usual comfort, they are engaging in a quiet act of courage. It might be as simple as answering a vulnerable question without deflecting. It might look like sitting through an uncomfortable conversation instead of ghosting. It could mean choosing to apologize instead of disappearing into silence. These are not easy decisions for someone whose reflex is to shut down. But they are evidence that love is creating a shift. Comfort for an avoidant is emotional distance love, disrupts that distance with presence. Comfort is control love, invites surrender. Comfort is certainty love, introduces unpredictability. And yet, when the love is genuine, safe, and patient, the avoidant starts to believe that connection is worth more than the illusion of safety. The walls they built for protection become barriers to intimacy, and they begin to feel the cost of their isolation. This realization doesn't come from pressure, it comes from something deeper: resonance. A sense that this person, this connection, is worth the discomfort, worth the work, worth the risk. Choosing connection over comfort doesn't mean the fear goes away. The fear is still there, whispering warnings about abandonment, engulfment, and betrayal. But real love helps them quiet that voice. It helps them see that closeness can exist without losing the self. That connection doesn't have to mean control. That opening up doesn't have to end in disaster. It allows them to stay in the relationship not out of obligation or performance, but because they genuinely want to. That internal shift from "I need to protect myself" to "I want to share myself" is sacred. It reflects an emerging willingness to be seen, to be known, and to be affected by another person. That doesn't come from fear. They suddenly become comfortable with vulnerability, but because the person in front of them matters more than their discomfort. They begin to realize that withholding emotion doesn't protect the relationship, it isolates them within it. And that isolation becomes more painful than the fear of being seen. So they start pushing against their default patterns. They speak when it's hard. They stay in the conversation when everything inside wants to shut down. They give words to feelings they were taught to bury. Not because it's easy, but because it's real. It's important to understand that avoidants aren't emotionless. They are simply emotionally cautious. But in the presence of love, they begin to see that caution has a cost. Silence starts to feel like self-betrayal. Avoidance begins to feel like missed opportunity. And so they take the risk. They begin to share what they actually feel, perhaps not fluently, and not all at once, but sincerely. They might say, "I'm scared," or "I don't know how to say this," or "This is hard for me." Those words, however simple, are acts of emotional bravery. Over time, communication becomes more natural. The avoidant starts to see that speaking their truth doesn't have to lead to conflict or abandonment. Instead, it deepens connection. Their partner responds with empathy instead of judgment. Conversations that once would have sent them into retreat now become bridges instead of battlegrounds. They begin to trust not only the other person, but also themselves to handle discomfort, to regulate emotion, to speak from the heart without being consumed by it. That's what true love does. It teaches the avoidant that expression is not weakness, it's intimacy. That words, when honest, don't destroy closeness, they create it. And that the courage to communicate, even imperfectly, is the very thing that transforms a relationship from surface level to soul level. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, emotional storms feel like a threat to their very sense of control and safety. When conflict arises, when emotions run high, or when vulnerability is required, their instinct is to pull back physically, emotionally, or both. Their nervous system has been conditioned to believe that closeness in moments of intensity will lead to pain, rejection, or engulfment. So instead of leaning in, they shut down. Instead of talking it through, they walk away. It's not because they don't care, it's because the experience of staying feels overwhelming and unsafe. Avoidants learned early on that expressing needs or emotions might be met with dismissal, punishment, or chaos. So they adapted. They became self-reliant, emotionally distant, and masters of detachment. To stay during emotional conflict would have once felt like standing in the middle of a fire with no way out. Their survival strategy was to get out before the flames got too high. But when an avoidant experiences real soul-level love, this begins to shift. Love doesn't remove the fear, but it introduces a new motivation connection. And for someone who spent most of their life disconnecting, that motivation is revolutionary. When avoidants truly love someone, they start to question their default behavior. Their partner's tears don't just trigger discomfort, they trigger a desire to comfort. Their partner's anger doesn't just make them want to leave, it makes them want to understand. The emotional storm still feels overwhelming, but now the cost of running away feels heavier than the fear of staying. They begin to recognize that every time they shut down, they leave someone they care about alone in the dark, and love won't let them keep doing that. So they begin to stay, maybe awkwardly, maybe silently, but they stay. They resist the urge to walk away mid-argument. They fight against the pattern of ghosting or stonewalling. They choose to remain in the room, to listen even when their heart is racing, to try even when their instincts scream otherwise. These moments are not always graceful, but they are sacred, because for an avoidant, presence in the middle of emotional chaos is not passive, an act of bravery. It's a new behavior forged through the fire of love. This doesn't mean avoidants become instantly fluent in emotional intimacy. Often, they struggle to find the words to stay calm, to regulate their own internal panic. But the very act of not leaving is growth. It's healing. It's proof that love is creating space for a new version of them to emerge. A version that no longer runs, but roots. A version that understands that emotional storms don't have to destroy connection, they can deepen it. And as they practice this presence, something beautiful happens. They start to realize that not all emotional intensity is dangerous, that staying doesn't always lead to loss, that their presence in the storm is not only healing to their partner, it's healing to themselves. They learn they don't have to disappear to feel safe. They don't have to be perfect to be loved. They just have to be their imperfect, raw, honest. Love, when it's real, creates the safety that avoidance never had. It teaches them that presence is power, that sitting in the storm, heart open and hands trembling, is one of the most courageous things a person can do. And when they do it not once, but over and over, it rewrites everything. not just for their current relationship, but for every part of them that believed love and conflict couldn't coexist. Staying during the storm becomes the ultimate act of love, not just for the other person, but for themselves. Avoidants often struggle with consistency, not because they lack care or intention, but because they've spent much of their lives operating from a place of emotional self-preservation. Consistency requires presence, emotional engagement, and reliability, all things that feel inherently risky for someone who has learned to equate closeness with vulnerability and vulnerability with danger. Instead of showing up regularly in relationships, they may retreat, become hot and cold, or oscillate between connection and distance. These behaviors are often misread as disinterest or manipulation, but more often than not, they stem from fear of intimacy, fear of being overwhelmed, or fear of being exposed. Avoidants often thrive on distance. Space feels safe. Too much closeness can feel suffocating, and so they pull back, often without explanation. To others, this can feel like abandonment, but for the avoidant, it's simply a reflexive way of regaining internal balance when their emotional system feels overstimulated. The idea of consistently showing up in a relationship, even when it's hard or uncomfortable, challenges their deeply held belief that closeness is a threat. But true, authentic love begins to interrupt that pattern. When an avoidant truly loves someone, something inside them starts to shift. The desire to protect themselves is still there, but it starts to come into conflict with a deeper desire to protect the connection. They begin to feel the weight of their absences, the emotional cost of disappearing when things get hard. They notice how their unpredictability creates insecurity in the person they care about, and for the first time, they care enough to try something different. Love brings purpose to their presence. It calls them to show up, not just when it's easy, but especially when it's not. This doesn't happen all at once. It's not a light switch, it's a process. Maybe they start by sending a message after a difficult conversation instead of vanishing. Maybe they show up for plans they would previously canceled. Maybe they begin to respond instead of retreat. These may seem like small actions to someone else, but for the avoidant, they are profound acts of emotional reprogramming. Each time they choose to stay, respond, and be reliable, they're telling themselves a new story. I can be close without losing myself. I can be consistent without being consumed. Love teaches the avoidant that consistency isn't about perfection or performance, it's about trust. It's about being someone the other person can count on, not just in moments of harmony, but in moments of tension, misunderstanding, and vulnerability. It's about creating a safe emotional rhythm, something the avoidant may have never experienced, but now begins to understand and value. And the more they see the positive impact of their consistency, the calm it brings, the security it fosters, the more they're inspired to keep showing up. They begin to realize that love isn't just a feeling, it's a commitment, a choice to return again and again, even when discomfort arises. Avoidants often fear that consistency will trap them, that being always there means losing freedom. But real love doesn't imprison, it liberates. It shows them that they can be consistent and still be sovereign. That presence doesn't mean they're stuck, it means they're building something meaningful, something lasting. When avoidants love deeply, they begin to understand that the greatest act of devotion is not the grand gesture or the rare intense moment, it's the steady hand, the predictable presence, the text that says, "I'm here," the decision to stay after an argument, the quiet commitment to keep choosing the relationship, not just when it's easy, but when it requires effort. This kind of consistency doesn't come from obligation, it comes from love, from a place that says, "You matter more to me than my fear." And that choice, made daily, becomes the foundation for intimacy that lasts. Avoidants are often experts at hiding in plain sight. They can engage in conversations, go on dates, share laughs, and even say "I love you" without ever truly revealing the most vulnerable parts of themselves. They've learned to keep their inner world locked away, not because they don't want to be known, but because, at some point, being fully seen felt unsafe. Maybe they were judged when they opened up, abandoned when they were vulnerable, or made to feel that their emotions were too much. So over time, they developed the belief that being fully seen leads to being hurt, and they began to equate love with danger. This is why avoidants tend to curate the version of themselves they allow others to see. They'll show strength, independence, competence are traits that are impressive and safe. But they rarely expose their wounds, their insecurities, or the fragile truths buried deep inside. They might even fool themselves into thinking that this version of love own with a strong exterior and emotional distance is enough. But when real love enters the picture, it doesn't just accept the mask, it gently questions it. It says, I want more than just your best. I want the real you. When avoidance truly loves, something powerful begins to unfold. The emotional armor they've worn for years starts to feel heavy. They begin to realize that the relationship can't deepen unless they begin to share the parts of themselves they've hidden, even from themselves. And because they care so deeply, they begin to find the courage to open the door, even if only slightly. This isn't about oversharing or dramatic confessions. It's about slow, intentional revelation, a quiet whisper of truth where there was once silence, a moment of, I've never told anyone this before. That is how an avoidant shows they truly love, be allowing themselves to be seen. This act of self-revelation is not easy. Every moment of exposure feels like standing on the edge of a cliff, but love gives them a reason to step forward. It says, if this person sees who I really am and chooses to stay, maybe I'm not as unlovable as I thought. And that shift is life-changing. It rewires old patterns, replaces shame with acceptance, and allows the avoidant to experience a form of intimacy they may have never known before, an intimacy built on truth, not performance. Avoidants don't open up quickly. They test the waters. They might reveal a small insecurity, then retreat to see how it's received. If their vulnerability is met with empathy and presence, they'll come a little closer. If it's met with judgment or pressure, they'll likely shut down again. But when they feel emotionally safe, they'll begin to unfold in layers. Not all at once, but in a rhythm that reflects the depth of their love and the strength of their trust. They begin to share their fears of not being enough, their anxieties about being needed too much, their past hurts, their unspoken dreams, and even the ways they've sabotaged love in the past. To allow themselves to be seen isn't just about trusting the other person, it's about reclaiming a part of themselves that they've buried. It's about healing old wounds through connection. It's about experiencing love not as something to manage or protect against, but as something to receive and reciprocate. And in doing so, the avoidant begins to feel a kind of freedom they've never known. The freedom of being known and still being loved, not despite their flaws, but with them. When an avoidant truly loves, they don't just stay, they reveal. They let someone into the sacred inner space they've guarded for years. And in that moment of transparency, they're not just changing the relationship, they're changing themselves. Because being seen and still accepted is the very medicine they never knew they needed, and love, when it's real, gives it to them without condition. So what does it all come down to? It comes down to this. Real love has the power to awaken the parts of us we've hidden, the parts we were told were too much, too broken, too complicated. For the avoidant heart, love isn't just a relationship, it's a revolution. It breaks the cycle. It rewrites the story. It transforms avoidance into awareness, fear into faith, distance into devotion. When an avoidant chooses to stay, when they risk vulnerability, when they speak instead of shutting down, when they choose connection over comfort, that's not just love in action. That's transcendence. You see, love isn't about finding someone who makes everything easy. It's about becoming someone who can walk through the fire, look fear in the face, and still say, I'm here. I choose you. I choose us. So if you're the avoidant, this is your wake-up call. There is more available to you, more depth, more joy, more peace. But it's on the other side of your walls. And if you love someone who's avoidant, this is your reminder. Their silence doesn't mean they don't care. Their distance doesn't mean they're not fighting. Sometimes the greatest sign of love is them staying in the room, even when everything in them wants to run. Healing is possible. Connection is possible. And it starts when we choose courage over comfort, love over fear, presence over protection. Because when we do, we don't just change our relationships, we change our legacy. Thank you for showing up today, not just to listen, but to grow. Thank you for doing the inner work that most people avoid. Thank you for having the courage to love even when it's hard, especially when it's hard be. Because that's where the transformation happens. And that is where life truly begins. I honor your journey. I honor your heart. And I believe in what's possible for you. Thank you. Keep rising, keep loving, keep becoming.